Hello everybody, I'm Martin Itzkow with the Coalition of Cultural Communities with Families. I'm here with Kathleen.
Hi everyone, I'm Kathleen Vyrauen. I'm with the Ethnocultural Council of Manitoba.
We're here to start a conversation that begins today and will carry on, we believe, in the fall in a very different way. The focus is actually on the future of cultural communities in Manitoba. And the reason for that is because as you start thinking about what is Manitoba, what does it consist of, and to a large extent, do we know how many people actually have immigrant backgrounds? Well, we know now 20% do. And so Manitoba is a very important province in terms of being able to identify how cultural communities play an important role, and especially in terms of looking at what's the future of Manitoba. So today we're having a conversation, a general conversation, touching on a number of themes, and we'll see where the conversation takes us. The intention is that in the fall, we'll be back and we'll be able to identify a number of themes and bring more people to speak on the topic. And we think it's really important, especially from a perspective of looking at how do we actually make sense of equity, diversity, and inclusion from a cultural community point of view, and what role do cultural communities play within our society, generally speaking. So, Kathleen, what do you think about that topic as a topic of concern?
I think it's an important topic to cover because as we've seen sort of a shift in recent years, the amount of what immigration has done to sort of our tapestry of our communities across Canada, and then specifically here in Manitoba, I think these conversations of things like diversity and inclusion and what does that mean for how communities look has changed and needs to be ongoing to ensure that we are able to accommodate and create inclusive societies for all of these newcomers that are choosing to call Manitoba specifically home. So I think for us, we know that has changed over the last couple decades, and I think that it will continue to change into the future. So conversations like this are important because they help shape things like policy development and program development and how we allocate resources to those communities and what those needs are of those communities, and how we can better support them. So I think, yeah, it's an important topic, and it's a topic that will be ongoing, and there's many layers to it. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, from CMCCF's point of view, we have a first principle that guides us. We believe anybody that's involved in our society and actually has an impact based on government policies, no matter which level of government, should have a voice in the policy determination, often even the co-creation of it, as well as the evaluation and the troubleshooting. And what's interesting in the conversation about cultural communities, one of the most important factors that we are facing that we need to talk more about, outside of diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice as the underpinning, racism, hatred, and discrimination. And cultural communities face that all the time. And we know that's simply a fact of life. It's not acceptable. So the question is simply, when we bring forth the idea of actually having a sense of what is the future of cultural communities in the context of Canada, are we talking about a change in the way democratic principles are operationalized? Are we thinking differently in terms of what voices need to be brought forward? What role do they play? So let me ask you a question from maybe an intergenerational perspective. And we see this in terms of our conversations with younger people coming from very different communities and different places and generations within community. What do you think their voices would say about the future of cultural communities? How do they define cultural communities?
I think that there's probably very differently than what their parents or those first generation would think. I think that there is a shift. We always say that they sort of straddle that line, right? They straddle the line between two different cultural community, I guess, that, or two different identities that they may have, right? They have maybe values from back home and where they came from, and then there is the values of Canadian identity that maybe they need to adapt to in order to what they think be successful, whether that be education, employment, whatever that realm is. And then I think when they come here, it's hard to find that balance between, I feel like they have to sort of recreate a new identity that still encompasses both, right? So that they are not pleasing both worlds, but sort of, right? So I think that for those, like, I can identify as being part of that generation where I came to Canada when I was 4, but I grew up here. And there was that, sort of identity crisis that you have that I don't know which world I fit into anymore. Do I then just create my own world and my own identity based off of what I feel is important, and then take from each that I feel value and importance, and then that becomes my sort of compass that I navigate through the world with? So, and I think that there's so many people that have that and that are navigating it, and then they're going to be the future decision makers and the future of our society. So that will shift the way that structures then will have to be able to operate and be guided by, because those future decision makers are the ones that have grown up with these two sort of competing identities and then have created their own. So I think when we always talk about these like archaic systems and structures that never change. They've been the same for decades and centuries, and they're usually operated by the same people. But then when we have this new generation that's coming in, they're really advocating to change that system and the way that it's being operated because they don't fit into it anymore. So young people honestly we always say, like, they are the voice because they're the ones that are going to one day be the ones making those decisions. So, and in those positions to change those structures or create new structures. So I think for right now, it is it's hard for them to sort of, they're figuring out what their identity is, and then how does that then fit into the future?
So in terms of that fusion or that blending of how they see themselves in terms of which community or how do I live in multiple ways with multiple identities, I guess my question is, who's going to define you? And especially we've started thinking about systems and accessing resources. Because when we start talking about cultural communities, one of the conversations will be, I suspect, access to resources. And having equitable access to resources as every other part of Canadian society or Manitoban society deserves. But I actually have an interesting conversation with other people all the time about, so this is how I see myself, this is how I value myself. I may come from one community visibly, but within me, I actually straddle many different communities. But outside, people see me in a certain way. And how do those people who actually are making determinations about policy and practices, how do they know how to understand your lived experience when they don't necessarily know how to engage you? And speaking to some colleagues in Sweden recently, and they seem to be working very much with officials of government, various levels of government. One thing that they said that's been true for them is many of the systems, many people within the systems are afraid of that conversation. They're afraid to actually ask questions of, because they think they're going to be attacked for not knowing and not being respectful. So my question then in this process is how we will engage community members. We know we will, but it's the outside forces that impact, impinge, hinder sometimes in terms of policy. How do we bring those forces to the conversation, those people?
I think we always talk about things like representation matters. You hear that in terms of who is in those systems, and are there people in those systems that can be that trusted ally that communities feel comfortable engaging with. And if there isn't, well, that's an issue. And I think that you have to be able to say that that is an issue and then address it. So I think that there is a way to have authentic engagement and conversation. And if you're going, to me at this point, it seems like an excuse to say, oh, well, we're too nervous, we can't have that conversation. That to me is just underpinning.
But when they don't have the skills to listen in a certain way.
Then bring in an outside force to do that. I think it takes a first step to have a conversation to say, okay, you know what, we actually don't know how to authentically engage with this community. Go to community and ask who is the best person to have this conversation or support us in having this conversation, and seek that support and help. To me, it just always seems like I don't really see why you would not want to, if you actually want and you're actually willing to authentically want to engage with that community, have them be a part of the conversation. Have them be, just seek out a facilitator that can help mediate and bring those communities together. It doesn't always need to be, okay, well, it's just government or it's just whoever, so then we're going to be the only ones.
So let me ask you this question.
Yeah.
So, working in community for many years and thinking about this in terms of the agenda that many people I work with have for that kind of engagement, it may be a different agenda and a different outcome that they wish to see than the people that they want to engage from within the systems. I mean, we're focusing on that as an idea, but in reality, it is a theme that seems to emerge all the time when we have conversations with people who are racialized Manitobans, come from various communities, have different kinds of lived experience. And it's always about the fact that they don't believe they're being listened to. They don't believe that they've been heard. They don't believe they've been respected. And they also don't believe that people who are making a lot of decisions on their behalf, public policy in many areas, understand deeply what the lived experience means. And there's a sense that the people who are making those kinds of decisions have only one way of viewing the world and have only one way of engaging. And now with technology, it's very much seeking input through technology, through various surveys and so on. But the question that have come back to me over and over again by communities, when do we get a chance to sit one-to-one for people to know who we really are?
So that's when we talk about things like authentic engagement. So what is your engagement and the purpose of your engagement? I think that the practices that we've used, again, in prior years or whatnot, have been very archaic, and they're very intrusive to community, where you come, you take their story, you take the piece that you want to hear, and that becomes what those systems grab onto.
They're exploiting.
Basically, you are exploiting community, I think, in that sense. And there's been a shift, at least I can speak for in the settlement community, and the way that we do engagement is that community has to be actively involved from the beginning to the end, and then you have to be able to give community ownership of that after to do what they want with it. Whatever that information may be that you're gathering, it's their story. It's not your story to take, have it as your own, and then have ownership of it.
So does it change policy? Has it been changing policy?
I think that it
practice?
depends on who you speak to. I've seen that shift in research in the way that academia has taken engagement with community. There's a slow shift there in the way that we do things like consultations or focus groups. There's been even a shift in language to allow community, again, to be part of the process from the beginning all the way to the end result. And then that end result, there's a lot more focus on mobilizing after, the mobilization of that information after, to turn into something that's tangible for community to use.
How about public policy? Pick an area.
To me, honestly, not really, because those systems are still very archaic. There hasn't been a mind shift in understanding that the methods that they're using can be.
Forget about systems. Talk about the people who are involved in that process.
What do you mean?
People who are making the decisions. So they have a culture. They have a certain type of culture of engagement. They have a very specific purpose in mind to obviously be able to either confirm, change, something that's important for them that they've actually been tasked within their system, whether it's coming directly from the government that's obviously in the situation right now, making a decision about what they want. But my question simply is, you can talk about the systems are the culture, but what about the individuals in those departments, in those areas that are making decisions? What's stopping them from actually having those conversations and engaging people in community about how that lived experience influences their decision to actually put a policy in place or to revise a policy? What is it about the individual in those positions? Forget about the systems.
Well, I think then that's individual biases, that's maybe not knowing, that's fear of, is my decision making going to reflect poorly on me as an individual? If I am in a decision making authority and then say publicly that like I don't know, maybe I don't know how to engage with this community, does that then make me, how does that make me as an individual look? But I think we have to 100% shift away from that, because you in turn are just doing more damage to entire communities by allowing your fear and your own biases to reflect progress in working with communities.
Absolutely, and I mean, we're not blaming the individuals per se. At this moment, there is something that we know from our experience where many people who are involved in policy or influencing policy are making a lot of assumptions, and also, to a large extent, there are biases we all have in favor of something, against something. But what's interesting now is the numbers of people who are coming from the immigrant community, broadly speaking in Manitoba, is increasing tremendously, quickly. So there'll be more and more people coming from diverse communities who will probably over time demand changes that actually reflect their needs in a very different way. So when we start thinking about the future of cultural communities, what's the role of cultural communities to address that mechanism or those processes where their voices are being heard, maybe not in a correct way, not necessarily, from my understanding, in a respectful way, but where their voices will need to be heard, but in a very different way.
I think it's also like allowing community to know that they have a voice. I think that there's so often community doesn't know when to engage. They wait for someone to approach them and ask the questions, not knowing that, you know what, there are mechanisms in place for you to take that step as a community member and engage in the system and have your voice heard.
But are they safe? Are they feeling safe?
No, and I will say that that's not always. I think that lots of those engagement mechanisms are not safe, and they can do harm, and that is a deterrent for community members to not want to engage, or those systems are so hard to navigate that they just lose hope and feel like they can't do that. Absolutely. So yeah, I do think that that is a deterrent, but I think that you have so many, I don't think that it needs to always be such an individualized like engagement session or like mechanism, right? Like there is community there. There is strength in numbers, and there are others that will support you and help coach and also like be with you, have the same message, right? So I know that in at least the settlement community, there's like a really big push right now to want to ensure that community knows like you do have a voice, and this is the way that you can do it. This is the way that you can authentically engage and have your voice heard. And we as a community in the settlement community will support you, knowing that those systems may not always be safe.
So how do we actually then work with the systems to ensure that they actually are being able to establish ways to be safer for people, being more respectful for people, not demeaning people, and being, I guess, available to understand that they need to shift and change their understanding of the other?
So I think like, I can only really speak from like my experience is like, honestly, just letting them know that that actually exists. I think you have so much denial often that within those systems and those structures that doesn't happen. We've never seen it happen, so that can't be true. but it's showing those like firsthand experiences, and it's calling it out when it is happening and saying, actually, you know what you're doing right now is extremely discriminatory, or this is not a safe space for me as a community member to speak to you in this setting, or the way that you're engaging with me right now is not appropriate. I think that feeling that like empowerment to be able to call it out in that moment, and letting those systems know that this is not authentic engagement.
But that's not panacea. I'll give you an example. Not that long ago, there was an engagement that CMCCF did with an unnamed part of the system. And what was really interesting to watch, almost as objectively on the side, as the conversations were taking place between folks from a system and also people from community, is that the system actually gave the impression that in the conversation they were erasing the people who came to talk, because what they were asking for was something they didn't want to talk about. So they literally, I think, perhaps were tone deaf to it, but also they erased the people. They made them feel invisible. And a while afterwards, there was a conversation between myself and some other people from the systems just to talk about it, and they were oblivious. They're really unaware. Again, not bad people, but unaware of what they did in that kind of context. And I wonder how often, in the context of looking at the future of cultural communities with larger numbers, how will we actually start engaging the systems, many different human systems that exist, whichever level of government, whichever institution there is, to change? And there is an assumption made, and that's really a conversation of leadership of the future. And that would be a theme I think we're going to move forward in talking about. So the younger generation are not leaders of the future, they're leaders now moving into the future. How do we bring that focus and their capacity into seeing how they can actually also engage systems differently, including technology?
I was just going to say, it was like we are moving into such a world right now where you have things like cancel culture, or you have things where, it's so easy for people to just call you out publicly and draw attention to the fact that, again, your practices are discriminatory. You're actually choosing to exclude or be exclusionary to a group or individual. I think that we are now living in that world where there's sort of a fear that anything that you do that's not appropriate is going to be put on a public platform.
So that increases the fear that everyone's talking about.
Yeah, so I think it is sort of like a chicken or egg situation, where are you then just pushing people more into closed off, where they're just like, okay, well then we're not going to make our practices publicly accessible because we're just going to do what we need to do, and then you don't get an engagement, and you will only engage with you when we feel is necessary. And then you have, similar to your situation with CMCCF, where you're trying to engage and then you're reaching sort of like that brick wall.
So what's the role of a cultural community, or how we're defining broadly cultural communities, in being able to see mechanisms and ways moving forward to address that possibility of more fear being created in those who have the power to actually potentially fear the engagement, do it only one way, perhaps not even develop relationships of trust, and maybe go even further by saying it's even more fearful now because no matter what step we take, we will always be attacked. And the fear itself will stop a process, potentially, of engaging by thinking about relationship building before content. Not even thinking in a sense that it's about the task of engagement. The task is about building relationships of trust before any form of formal, informal engagement to solve a challenge or create a new policy or do some co-creation of new services. It's about the relationship building. And I wonder how much that is a theme that doesn't necessarily exist right now from a cultural community point of view, of saying simply, if we're moving forward, we need to build different kinds of relationships with many partners and many systems, so that we're taken into consideration, but also our voices are heard even before there's a concern for policy development.
And I don't think that happens very often. I think the engagement always comes when there's an issue.
Who calls the engagement?
It depends. I think sometimes it could be both. Like if
But how often is it the cultural community that's asking for the engagement? Or is it the system, many systems that are saying it's time for us to engage because we need to seek some information about a policy?
I think it's both
how
ways.
often is it both ways?
I think it goes both. I think it does happen both ways. I think that, there's something big that happens in the cultural community, and then they go and they say, okay, well, we have to lobby a system to get that changed. And then I think you have the system that's like, okay, well, we can't address that thing until we go back into the community because we need information, we need statistics, we need data. Right. So then they go to the community. But I don't think that there's just enough of that, like you mentioned, that relationship building. How often do those systems just come to the community to say, I actually just want to know what goes on in your day-to-day? Like, what does your community organization do? What is it that you offer? If you asked systems on general, can you name what this community organization does? They would have no clue.
But it works the other way too.
Very true. Yeah, I do agree.
We had recently we had another engagement with a range of cultural community folks, and they were more informal leaders, just members of community. And the question was simply, we don't necessarily understand how systems work. We don't understand the nonprofit sector. We don't even know who they are. And the question was simply, and we are very interested in engaging cultural communities and service providers. And the question is, which service providers were they interested in engaging? And for this group of people, they were still angry about the immigration settlement process. They had been here for years. So their focus was that. It was not the other generic services, and there's hundreds of nonprofits, and they just didn't have the knowledge to navigate that part of the system. They didn't understand and navigate government and which level of government was engaged in this. So it seems to me that in the future of cultural communities, they need to also become really good navigators of systems and be able to understand where within systems they're able to navigate to make change.
So whose role is that then to start?
That's a good question. I don't know. Is it both? It seems to me there's a conversation of both.
Yeah.
And then to me it's, from a public policy point of view, if there's truly going to be open and authentic engagement, and people will feel that my voice is being heard, my lived experience is meaningful, then there is a responsibility of both parties to figure out how do they learn from each other, how do they have a mutual learning process long term, so they start to realize that the other voices matter, but I need to understand who you are, I need to understand what things mean to you, and I need to understand what your outcomes are compared to my outcomes. And I think in terms of some of our work, which has been really interesting, is whose agenda is it? It's got to be a shared agenda. When do we ever have a shared agenda?
Usually, there's a shared agenda only if there's a larger issue that needs to be addressed.
But is it truly shared?
Not really. It's probably definitely once balanced off to one side.
It's interesting because in some of our conversations, and we've had this conversation before, when we've engaged systems, and that's still an amorphous kind of conversation, what system are we talking about? It was always, whose agenda are you at the table trying to convince us is important. So invariably we've had conversations, well, it's a community agenda. No. It's a system agenda, and you're actually thinking it has a direct bearing on community, and it may or may not. So how do we ever get to the conversation from a cultural community point of view of clarifying shared vision, shared ownership, shared values, and potentially a place where there's something that actually they're working together on, not because it's a responsibility of a system to actually take action in this way and then expect people to participate. But in reality, they never ask the question, how do we come to a shared agenda? That's I think, an important part of thinking about what the future of cultural communities are. How do we get to that conversation and not be afraid? Because I think both parties are afraid in many ways.
There's been lots of historical damage, so it's undoing all of that, right? To sort of get to a place where they are able to have, again, authentic engagement. What does that mean? I think that we haven't, there's that idea is different for both the system
Absolutely.
versus community, right? So I think having a definition of that is extremely important as well. But
And I don't want to just focus on the negative, because there are people and systems that we both work with who things are really working well in some ways, and it'd be wonderful if we could actually take what's working well and what could even be better together and really start thinking about how do we build from strength. And so I guess in the conversation of what is the future of cultural communities, the role of those systems become a really important part of that conversation, because they will also help us understand how they see what a community and how valuable a community is to their work. So what are some of the things you think we're missing in this conversation that we will have to talk more about?
I think it'd be extremely interesting to know, and this is one of the things that we have talked about, is how do those personal values that they have had from back home play into creating that community and that life here in Canada or wherever it is that they choose to settle. I think for us, when we talk about cultural communities, that in itself is so vast. We've had conversations about what does the term community mean? What does the term family mean? It's so encompassing of so much. It's not just,
Absolutely.
parent, child, auntie. Family can be whoever you make. Same with community, right? Each individual is so different. So I think with that, then you have all of these values or biases even, and all of that plays into this new place that you are and this new identity that you're trying to build here. And I think that it would be so interesting to know how that differs within each, and if that then changes the way that engagement has to happen with those systems. Because I think when systems try to engage with community, oftentimes you find the community that has the same value, and that is who you engage with. And then it sort of solidifies what your cause is. And you said, see, okay, yeah, you think the exact same way that I think. So that means,
bias.
exactly. Yeah. So then, but is that community able to authentically represent everyone? Probably not, right? So I think and are they then doing the work to engage with others to get differing points of view? Probably not.
Absolutely.
So I think for me, when we think about, again, like authentic engagement, who is it that you are engaging with, vice versa? And is that narrative an accurate representation of what is actually happening out in the world?
But can it ever be in that kind of situation? I mean, your point about values.
Yeah.
So going back now, before COVID, we did some engagements with members of many communities around values, and we brought service providers together. And we had an interesting conversation about were they seeing the same world or seeing the world in the same way by using the same language as values. And some were right on and some were completely different. I'm not sure they were shocked, but for us, as observers to the process and really in a sense facilitating it was pretty clear that we had never had those conversations between diverse service providers and communities to even get to know what were important for both of us, what were the important elements for both of us, and how we saw the world. And I think what happened is the biases started to show. If we would have had more time to do that, because ultimately it is really, again, the future is how do you bring more and more people to talk about these things, to actually start to realize that there is something being shared here that's not just the cultural communities, but also it's a connection to the fabric of our society. So it has a direct bearing. If you think you don't have a relationship with people who've come to Canada recently, I think you're absolutely wrong, because they're actually impacting you every day. But I think from the values point of view, that's such a powerful place to begin, because I think we think that we're speaking from the same voice and we have the same vision, and we don't. And so from a cultural community point of view, our purpose of moving forward with this is to really say cultural communities have a really important voice here, but it will also force other people who do not have a relationship or understand this to start looking inward in terms of, are our values the same? Are we speaking in a very different way to what matters to us? Do we have anything in common, or are we actually very different? You know, so the values conversation. But let me ask you about shared vision. If you brought people together from basically many new communities, you know, racialized, non-racialized, would they say the same future of Manitoba based on their lived experience? Would they see it very differently?
I think that there would be differences for sure. I think that there's probably a commonality that could be found between each, but I think, again, it depends, right? Everyone's settlement journey is so different as an individual, but then even as a cultural community, there's things that affect them, whether it be war and conflict, whether it be you came here for employment purposes, whether it, like, those journeys are all so different. So I think that has to also be taken into account. So I think, it will vary. It will always vary. And I think as settlement providers or working in the settlement sector, we also have to think about that in the way that we engage, because with the work that we're doing, lots of it has to be we consult with communities on a daily basis. But I think one of the things that we've started to think about often is, again, who is it that we're engaging with? And if that is then forming the plan for the way that we're going to move forward in the work that we do, are we capturing all the voices that we could be capturing? And is this an accurate representation? So it's always in the back of our mind is thinking, are we capturing everyone's voice that needs to be around the table?
So probably my last question.
Okay.
And I think it's an important one. The way we've been describing the cultural communities and going forward and relationship systems, it's very much about consumers of services.
Okay.
In a sense, we are hoping to get the voices heard so that people will have access to more resources. So it's around being a consumer. My question is, how do we have a conversation about cultural communities as citizens, not consumers? As citizens. Citizens now, citizens in the future, and their role in democracy, and their role in leadership in community, broadly speaking. Where do we put that conversation in this mix?
Well, I think it's extremely important, and that should be from the get-go, like, how do I say this politely? First of all, I think are we engaging them from their first settlement here, like from the first time that they settle here in our province? What is our engagement with them to allow them to know, as a citizen, you're contributing to this society in this way, this way, this way? I think that idea of them being a consumer of resources and whatnot, that may be the way that we have presented you as an individual are here, like, we're here to serve you, to ensure that you are getting the resources, but really they are contributors just as much to our society, to our economy, to the building of our structures in terms of policies and programs. All of that will be affected by, again, their journey and their lived experience and their skills and abilities. All of that will play into the growth of our province or our city. So they have to be able to contribute to that. But again, those systems are not safe. Those systems are not created to allow those individuals or those communities to contribute in a way that is effective.
Definitely.
It's exclusionary right now. So I think we have things like you talk about like voting. We advocate for things like permanent residents being allowed to vote in municipal elections. Other provinces and other cities across Canada are starting to look at that, but that's not something that Winnipeg has thought about. We have people that advocate for that, but they pay taxes and they contribute, but why would we then not allow them to authentically engage in saying who their leadership or who represents them on a political level? You're excluding them from that. So I think that and then we talk about things like diversifying what our political parties look like or what our decision makers look like. Well, what are their values and what are their, like, how does that play into then these platforms that we're going to put them on to be able to make decisions for not just their community, but for all of the citizens as a whole. So I think that there's a lot to think about in that. But first of all, we have to ensure that those systems, that they can access them in a way that allows them to contribute. Because right now they can't.
I think this conversation, which we'll have more of, will have to address the barriers, the obstacles, the mythologies. Because there's a set of mythologies around employment and access to the labor market that I continue to hear about the fact that they're doing incredibly well. They've been very helpful to our economy. But then you hear the stories of the lived experience of that experience is not very positive. So there's a lot more we have to dig into. So I think we've started this conversation. There are a range of things we've started to play with. And we just wanted to throw that out to everybody as an example of conversation. And as we go forward, we believe in the fall we'll get back together again and have conversations with more people and identify the key themes that we want to bring forward. So thanks for watching the show today, and thank you for Kathleen for being a part of this, and thank you, Multicultural. We really appreciate it.